In the dying light of the Old West, a cowboy named Jonah Reeves wandered the desert alone, his horse spent, his heart hollow, and his past chasing him like a ghost. When thirst finally brought him to his knees, the wind answered not with death, but with a boy, a Comanche child carrying a waterskin, and a truth that would change every mile Jonah had left. This is the story of the man who drank forgiveness. Part 1. The Country That Drinks Men. The Llano rose like an ocean the sun had forgotten to set. A flat, glittering reach of grass and caliche, where distance grew teeth. Heat came not in waves but in a single flattening sheet, pressed down by a sky the color of hammered tin. The wind had claws in it. It combed the plains one way and then back again, leaving everything rougher than before. Jonah Reeves rode with his hat pulled low and his mouth set in the shape of a man measuring himself against a number he didn't like. He had run out of water exactly 3 miles ago, by his best counting being all he had left that didn't betray him. Every fourth step his gelding Ash, a smoke-colored thing with a temper like winter mesquite, stumbled and caught himself, hooves punching shallow cups in white dust. The sound of it was hollow. Everything out here was hollow. Old buffalo bones, dewless yucca stalks, Jonah's canteen. He lifted the canteen anyway, as a man will lift a letter he's already read, hoping new words might have written themselves where there were none. He tipped it. 3 hot drops tapped his tongue. They tasted like tin and sorrow. He held the empty thing there a second longer, because letting it fall would turn thirst from a feeling into a fact. "Easy, boy," he said, voice rasped down to rope. "We'll find a seep yet." Ash flicked an ear and kept moving because that was the deal between them. Jonah lied, and the gelding pretended not to notice. A strip of dried rawhide hung from the saddle horn, where Jonah had tied a handkerchief earlier and forgotten why. He'd been forgetting more lately. Names of towns, faces that used to own names. How old he was the last time laughter felt like something a man did, and not some noise the mouth made when a story demanded it. The Llano gave back no answer, only distance. Yucca bayonets stood like sentries that had quit caring. Prickly pear sprawled low, its pads the green of old bruises, studded with spines that glowed when the sun turned just so. A line of antelope on the far rim watched him as still as rocks with eyes. Overhead, a buzzard painted lazy circles, and pretended it wasn't waiting. Jonah's left knee ached, a ghost of a bullet he hadn't deserved and hadn't dodged in a county whose name he didn't speak anymore. He'd carried worse things than lead. The silence after the coughing stopped in a dugout winter. The letter with words he read but didn't believe because believing turned them into the shape of a grave. The house he built that leaned, even when the wind lay down. He'd walked away from all of it the way men do when staying starts to feel like drowning in a basin no bigger than a washtub. He rode west, not towards anything but away from something. A boy's laugh that belonged to nobody now. A woman's eyes that had learned to look at him as if he was a door that wouldn't open. The Llano didn't ask questions. It wasn't that kind. It took a man on his own terms, and asked only what he had in his pockets, and how many miles he could grind out of bone. By noon the heat got clever. It crawled inside his coat and sat there, panting. The wind changed. Less a wind than the breath of a kiln. Jonah slipped his boots loose in the stirrups to let whatever air there was reach his damp socks. The smell of him was hoarse and dust, and the last of last night's coffee cooked onto his mustache. He tasted salt every time he licked his lips, which he did too often. He made himself stop. He had learned years back that the body will trick itself into thirst if you let it. There was a trick of the country he'd learned too. Green wasn't always water. Greener was sometimes poison. Greasewood kept its own counsel. Cottonwoods could lie. But the way grass thinned, and the ground went from grit to something that kept footprints a shade longer, meant a wash somewhere ahead. Not a stream. Streams were fairy stories. You told Easterners to get them to buy land, where rain forgot the way home, but a seep maybe, a bare wink of wet under a lip of stone, enough to keep him and the horse a day further from being another story the wind told. Ash's head bobbed. The horse's tongue showed every so often, a quick pink ribbon between teeth, and then snapped back as if embarrassed. Jonah leaned forward and rubbed the base of the gelding's neck, where sweat had salted into hard lines. "You're stubborn," he said. "That's what I like about you. That and you don't tell me things I already know." The buzzard lowered its circle a mean inch. Jonah smiled without humor and lifted 2 fingers to the sky in a manner that would have got him thrown out of a church. "Find yourself another parade, cousin," he muttered. "We ain't it today." He aimed for a line of red rock that lifted out of the plain like a ship's keel run aground. The locals called such things mesas if they were generous, or just that damned back of nowhere if they were not. This one had a notch like a missing tooth. A notch meant shade if you caught it before the sun slid past and turned shade into story. He prodded Ash with his heel. Not hard. Ash knew the difference between a lie and a command, and Jonah tried not to speak both at once. They reached the cut when the day was at its noisiest. Noon isn't loud the way thunder is. It's loud the way a pressure cooker is constant, everywhere. The kind of sound your bones hear but your ears don't. Shade fell like a coin dropped on a table. Not much, but better than empty pockets. Jonah swung a leg over and found the ground farther down than he remembered it being last time he swung a leg over. His knee tried to be unhelpful. He let it, then made it get with the program. Ash stood with both front legs planted and let his breath saw through him. Jonah slid the bit and loosened the cinched 2 holes. He'd always said a man who cinched a horse tight at rest was telling the Lord he didn't want to see morning. He took the canteen again, fool's ritual, and got what a fool gets. He didn't cuss. He'd spent most of his cussing in the years that deserved it, and had learned the rest. Don't listen. The notch held a sliver of breeze that smelled like rock warming and cooling, which is to say it smelled like nothing a man could drink. He dropped his hat on the stone between his boots and let the heat lift off his scalp. Salt made white lines where sweat had dried on the band. He traced one with a filthy thumb and thought of a boy drawing in flour with a stick on a kitchen table that didn't creak then. He shoved the thought away, as you do a plate you can't afford. A rattling came from the crack in the red wall. Not that kind. Grasshoppers? A whole choir chewing the present into the future, one blade at a time. He chuckled a single dry bark. "Sing me something wet," he told them. They were not that kind either. The horse nosed the ground, worked his lips at a patch of weed that had no juice left to surrender. Jonah tore off a strip of jerky smaller than a prayer and chewed it because chewing took the mind off wanting and gave the jaw a job. The meat was an old shoe salted with memory. It made his mouth any drier and he ate it anyway. Doing the wrong thing slowly felt better than doing nothing fast. He dozed not because he meant to, but because a man can't hold his own head up forever. It dropped. The world tipped. A sound inside his skull like wagon wheels faded down a road. He woke with his hat on the ground and a new sun in the old sky. And the shadow had shifted thin as a rumor. He swore then, not loud. There wasn't enough spit in him for loud. Up, he told himself and the horse and the world. We're wasting our share. They picked up the wash again, whatever it was, a scar in the plain, where water had once remembered itself. The banks were a hand high and then 2. Jonah reads sign the way a man reads a face in a mirror he doesn't love. Reluctant, but honest. Coyote had crossed last night. His prints were soft-edged and arrogant. A mule deer had put 2 feet here, and then thought better of it and turned. A single little moccasin print, no. That was wind shape playing at men again. He squinted, ground moved, and the shape became what it should have been. Nothing. He kept on. Time doesn't pass out here. It spreads. The sun had the patience of a lawyer. Every so often, Jonah told himself he'd count to 100 and then he'd get to stop. At 98 he realized he'd counted to 100 wrong. He started again and made it to 64 before he forgot what 90 felt like, or why it mattered different than 60. Spring under a lip of stone, a drover had told him in Tascosa, eyes red from something that wasn't smoke. Look for where the grass changes its mind. Look for flies acting like they're in church. Jonah had tucked the words away the way you tuck away $1 in a boot heel when the world's mean. He looked for both and got neither. The wind veered and brought the smell of nothing in a new direction. Ash stumbled. This time he went down to one knee and stayed, head drooping like a church flag after a funeral. Jonah slid off fast, because a man who stays seated when his horse goes down wants to learn about falling from the ground up. He took the gelding's head in both hands and lifted, which is a fool thing to do, and he did it anyway. The horse worked to find his feet, found them, shook once like a dog at a creek he hadn't seen in a year, and stood listing a degree to starboard. "Don't be noble," Jonah said, breath stuttering. "Noble gets you dead." He touched the jugular, the big river under a horse's jaw. It thumped fast. Too fast. He could count that. He did. He stopped counting when numbers stopped being comfort and started being a map to a bad place. Beyond the wash, the land sloped hardly at all, which means it sloped more than a man wants it to when every step costs. Red Mesa lay ahead, its face cut by time into ledges where hawks sat and judged. Beneath the lowest shelf the earth darkened. A whisper of damp. It could have been a lie. The Llano told them regular. He believed this one the way a man believes his last hand, because there isn't another one in the deck. He walked now, reins over his arm, his palm across Ash's cheek every dozen steps. That little life-anchoring touch men give beasts and boys and themselves. His boots filled with heat and gravel. Once he saw, out of the corner of his eye, a woman in a white dress, moving along the rim, not moving exactly but drifting as if the wind had learned a shape. He didn't look again. He kept his eyes on the place where the dark met the light under the rock. If he reached it and found damp, he'd drink forgiveness. If he reached it and found dust, he'd lie down where a man could pretend a shadow meant mercy. Closer now, the air held a change that wasn't smell so much as a silence in the throat. Flies 2, 3. Then a congregation looped in little delirious circles. The ground gave under his heel, a fraction, like a pillow, remembers a head. He knelt. The motion took the last good coin from his pocket. He put one hand on the earth, then the other, and the heat of the stone under his palm told him nothing new. He dug anyway, scooping with fingers, then with his knife. A little basin where the dirt went from powder to something that held together the way a story does when truth shows up late. Water showed itself not as a pool. Pools were for men who wore city shoes, but as a shine, a darkening that climbed his skin and made the fine hair there stand up like prairie dog tails. He pressed both hands to it and brought them to his mouth, and what touched his tongue was life and mud and the taste of old leaves, and it was beautiful. He didn't groan the way men do in plays. He wept once without tears and put his hands back and did it again. Then he remembered the horse. Ash's head came down like the last hour of a long day. Jonah cupped and lifted because that's what you do for friends older than yourself. He let the gelding take what he could hold and kept pulling him back between swallows, the way a sensible man does with a fevered child. "Slow," he said, "and breathe. And you'll hate me if I let you drown on a hill." The damp grew a fragile skin, a mirror for a sky that had no right to be this blue. He broke it and made another. The flies were drunk on good news. Out at the edge of sight, the buzzards sulked higher as if embarrassed by miscalculation. When the first rush of the hunger that isn't hunger eased, Jonah sat back on his heels, the knife still in his fist. The earth under his nails turned black as spilled coffee. He looked at the hole he'd made, and the little gleam in it, and the way it kept giving, and knew he hadn't conjured anything, he'd only asked in the right place the right way. He felt grateful and foolish, and very old. He didn't hear the boy at first. He heard the wind change key. Then the quiet that follows when a hawk passes, and all the smaller lives remember their manners. He felt eyes the way a man can feel a storm an hour before the sky gets the news. He turned slow, because quick is what you do when you want to scare things off. The boy stood 10 paces off, left foot on a rock, right foot in the dust, hair braided tight against his neck, a single hawk feather tied so it lay along the braid like a thought. He wore buckskin the color of stormed wheat, and a shirt the red of the mesa when it remembers dawn. A waterskin hung crosswise over his chest, dark with the memory of a stream Jonah had not seen in months. The boy's face was still the way the plains get right before a norther hauls its shoulders over the rim. Ash didn't spook. He lifted his head and then looked back at the hole, because a thirsty horse has his own manners. Jonah let the knife show in his hand another second, and then set it on the rock with the same care he'd set a pipe on a porch rail when his boy was small and watching. Afternoon, Jonah said, the word dry and formal and wrong, and the wind took it and rearranged it into nothing. The boy studied him, not unkind, not kind, only exact. His eyes were black glass and old. He took one small step nearer, and the waterskin shifted, a soft slap Jonah heard too loud. He thought about the empty canteen by his knee, about how a man's throat can close for reasons that have nothing to do with thirst. The boy lifted a hand and touched the waterskin like a man touches a talisman. When he spoke, his English rode beside other words Jonah did not know, like two riders sharing a trail. You will die if you drink only that, the boy said, chin tipping at the mud shine Jonah had clawed from rock. His voice was simple as a fence post. The earth is sick there. Jonah glanced at the hole he had decided was a miracle, and then back at the waterskin, and then at the boy's eyes. He felt all at once that the day had been standing on a hinge he hadn't seen, and something, somewhere, had just leaned on the door. He tried to find pride. It wasn't where he'd left it. He tried to find an argument. His tongue didn't fetch one. He did the other thing men do when they've run out of tools. He told the truth. I'm out, he said, nodding at the canteen that had been empty a long time, and the horse that had almost knelt to die. I was going to pretend this was enough until pretending finished me. The boy listened the way trees listen, not to the sound that's made but to the weight under it. He took another step, and the feather on his braid shifted like a clock's hand. He put his fingers to the waterskin's mouth and loosened the thong. My name is Tiva, he said, and there was wind in the name and a little stone. Comanche. My grandmother sent me to find a man who doesn't know the path to the next day. She said the wind carried his name, but I did not hear the name. I heard the thirst. He held the waterskin out, not quite to Jonah, not quite away from himself, and the skin darkened where his hand warmed it. The smell that came off it was metal and mountain shade and everything the Llano wasn't. Jonah did not reach. Not because he didn't want, and not because he was proud, because he had spent his life taking first and asking later, and the country had been keeping the books. He set both hands open on his knees so the boy could see, and put his head down a fraction, the way a man lets a colt sniff his hat brim before stroking the white star between its eyes. Jonah Reeves, he said, because the boy had brought names into it, and names mean more than water sometimes. If you hand that to me, I'll drink. If you don't, I'll dig, and we'll see which one of us the mesa keeps. I won't take it out of your hand. The wind paused to hear what the boy would do. Ash blew a soft breath through his nose, and the buzzard somewhere above folded one wing and changed its mind about something. Tiva regarded Jonah a heartbeat longer, and then stepped forward until the water's mouth stood over Jonah's empty mouth, like a small, dark sky. Drink, Tiva said, and the word was not permission. It was a sentence with only one right answer. He tipped the skin, and the first cool rope of it hit Jonah's tongue and went down his throat and found places in him no priest had. Water tasted like bells. It tasted like the inside of a cathedral you can only get into by walking a long way alone. He took 2 swallows and pulled his head back with the same discipline he'd used on the horse. He wanted to fall to the ground and let the boy flood him into a new river. He did not. He breathed and felt his hands again, and the way they shook a little less than they had been shaking all day. Tiva did not smile. He didn't stare, either. He tipped water into his own mouth, in a small, practical swallow, and then sent 3 careful streams to Ash, who lapped air and caught more than he missed. Then the boy corked the skin and slid it crosswise again. "You will not die today," Tiva said, as if correcting a ledger. "But if you stay in that place, your bones will learn the word that kills men faster than bullets." Jonah wiped his mouth with the back of his wrist and found mud and salt and something like awe there. "What word is that?" "What?" Tiva looked past him at the hole Jonah had clawed and the little shine in it, and the way it kept trying to be a mirror for a sky that could not be bothered. He said the word like it was smaller than it felt. "Alone." The Llano poured another hour of heat down in answer, and the mesa held its red breath. Jonah stood, slow so his blood would not forget where to go. He felt the hinge of the day give. He felt the door swing. He did not know yet what house it opened, or if it belonged to him, or if he had only been invited to rest on its step. He knew only that he had been handed a future the size of another swallow. He nodded once, the way a man nods to a stranger who has changed him. "All right," he said, throat working. "Show me where the water is that doesn't hate me." Tiva turned, the feather on his braid ticking once like a second hand, and started toward the red place where the world lifted. Jonah gathered the reins and the canteen, and the knife, and the part of himself that still understood following. Ash took a breath that sounded less like leaving, and more like staying, and put his feet where the boy's feet had been. The wind, which has always loved a good story more than a straight line, went with them. Part 2: The Trial of Thirst. The trail climbed out of the wash in a slow curve, the kind that fooled a man into thinking it was flat until his lungs said otherwise. The sun was leaning west, its edge dulling from white to brass, but the heat hadn't heard the news yet. It clung to Jonah's shirt and to Ash's hide, the two of them moving in silence behind the small figure of the boy. Tiva walked as if he'd been born to the rhythm of dust, each step measured, steady, and light. He never looked back to see if Jonah followed, just assumed he would. That small, unspoken faith was its own kind of command. The feather on his braid swayed in time with the wind, pointing them forward like a compass made from patience. "Your people live out here?" Jonah asked finally, the words cracked and pale. The boy didn't turn. "Not here. Farther north, where the river still remembers itself." "Then why are you here?" "Because you were." It wasn't an answer Jonah understood, but it was an answer the desert would have liked. He said nothing more. Words had weight. He'd already used more than his share that day. They passed what might have been a campsite, blackened stones in a ring, a single bone upright in the center like a marker. The air smelled faintly of smoke that had long since forgotten flame. Jonah's boots found an old horseshoe half buried in the dust. He bent, picked it up, and turned it over in his palm. A nail still clung to one hole. "Bad luck," he murmured. "Left behind with the hoof." Tiva glanced at it once. "Luck is only memory wearing another face." They kept walking. The mesa threw its shadow far and thin, a long blade cutting the plain. The wind had changed again, cooler now, tugging at Jonah's coat like an old friend asking him to turn around. He didn't. He'd run from too many ghosts to listen to this one. After an hour, or maybe it was a lifetime, they reached the foot of a canyon cleft So narrow the sky became a single stripe overhead. The air inside was different, cooler, echoing. Water had once lived here, long enough to carve its own name into the stone before it died. Now the walls carried only silence and the faint, metallic smell of moss. Tiva stopped, placed a palm against the rock, and whispered something low. Jonah couldn't tell if it was prayer or conversation. "You talking to it?" he asked. "Yes." "What's it say back?" The boy turned, and for the first time, a hint of a smile ghosted across his face. "That you don't listen well." Jonah huffed a laugh that sounded like disbelief. "You got that right." The canyon narrowed until they had to go single file. Ash's hooves struck sparks on the stone. Jonah's hand brushed a carving in the wall, an old pictograph. Circles, lines, the crude shape of a man standing beside a horse. The figure's hand was raised, fingers spread. Peace? Warning? He couldn't tell. At the far end, the canyon opened into a bowl of red earth. In its center stood a dead cottonwood, bark stripped, limbs reaching skyward like a prayer that never found the words. Around its base, small cairns, each built from 3 stones, too deliberate to be chance. Tiva knelt at one of them. "Here," he said. "Water sleeps beneath." Jonah knelt too. The soil was cooler here, damp beneath the surface. Together they dug Tiva with calm precision. Jonah with the frantic hunger of a man who'd known drought too long. When the first seep of moisture darkened the dirt, Jonah felt his heart knock against his ribs. He scooped, waited, and soon there was enough for the reflection of the boy's face beside his own. Tiva handed him a small wooden cup from his pouch. Jonah stared at it. The cup was carved rough but careful, the rim smooth from use. He filled it and offered it to Ash first. The horse drank greedily, muzzle dripping dark circles into the dust. "You learned that from your grandmother too?" Jonah asked. Tiva nodded. "She said you measure a man by how he treats what cannot speak. It not a do it braid." The cowboy thought on that. It landed somewhere between his ribs and stayed there. They drank in silence. The water was cold enough to make his teeth ache, a good kind of pain, like waking from a bad dream. He looked around the canyon, the stacked stones, the dry tree that stood sentinel over the small miracle, and for the first time in months, he didn't feel hunted by his own mind. But then Tiva spoke again, quieter. "This place keeps the dead. Not just my people. Yours too." Jonah stiffened. "How would you know that?" Tiva pointed to one of the cairns. Between the stones, a sliver of metal caught the light, a rusted spur, rowel, half buried. Jonah brushed dust away. Stamped into the steel was a faint letter R. His throat closed. Reeves. His family brand. His brother's spur. He stumbled back. "Air gone." "That where did those?" "My grandmother said the wind brings bones," Tiva said. "Sometimes it brings the names too." Jonah sank to his knees. The canyon spun slow and cruel. He saw his brother again, young, laughing, too wild for fences. Saw the day he'd ridden into a storm chasing cattle that didn't belong to him. Never came back. They'd said Apaches took him. Jonah had believed it, hated it, built years out of that hate. Now the truth sat quiet in the dirt, red and undeniable. "He died here?" Jonah's voice cracked. Tiva shrugged one shoulder. "He died thirsty. The earth kept him." The world tilted. Jonah pressed a hand to the ground, fingers digging into the soil, as if he could pull his brother back through it. The heat, the years, the lies, all of it broke loose inside him. His breath came ragged. "All this time I thought that we killed him?" Tiva's tone was calm, not accusing. "Hate is a fire that burns even when there's no wood left." Jonah looked up, tears carving clean paths through the dust on his face. "Then why help me?" "Because you were burning too." The wind sighed through the canyon like a tired witness. The last of the sun slipped behind the rim, painting everything in copper and ash. Ash the horse lifted his head and snorted softly, as if agreeing that something had just been buried right alongside the past. Tiva rose, brushing dirt from his knees. Come. Night is near. We will make camp above the wind. Jonah stood slowly, every muscle trembling with exhaustion, and something that wasn't just thirst anymore. He looked one last time at the cairn, the spur catching the last bit of light, and whispered, "Rest easy, brother." The wind answered by cooling his neck. They climbed to higher ground, where the mesa opened into stars. Jonah built a small fire, while Tiva unpacked what looked like dried sage and cornmeal, scattering a pinch into the flames. The smoke rose straight up, sweet and thin. "For the ones who wait," the boy said. Jonah watched the smoke twist skyward, and thought maybe it wasn't only the dead it was carrying. Part 3. The Journey and Revelation. Night on the mesa came not gently but all at once, like a door closing. One moment the canyon glowed with dying fire. The next, it was a bowl of ink pricked by stars sharp enough to cut. The air turned cold so fast Jonah could taste metal on his teeth. The fire they built was small. Tiva said large flames drew spirits who hadn't finished their stories. Jonah didn't ask whether that was a warning or an invitation. Ash stood tethered nearby, head low, dozing, steam lifting from his nostrils. The horse had drunk deep and was himself again, tired but steady, patient as stone. Jonah envied that patience. The boy sat cross-legged on the other side of the flames, face half in light, half in shadow. Smoke twisted through his braid, making the feather shimmer like a living thing. He held a small wooden flute, no longer than a man's forearm, carved with animal shapes that looked like they might leap if the song was right. Jonah's voice broke the quiet. "You play that for the dead too?" Tiva glanced up. "For the living who forget they're still alive." Jonah's mouth twitched. "You got a saying for everything." The boy shrugged. "The land teaches, if you listen." He raised the flute and played not a tune Jonah recognized, not even music by the rules of towns. It was a thread of sound that drifted in and out of silence, bending with the wind, catching in the hollows of the rock, and returning changed. Jonah closed his eyes, and for a moment, he was back on the porch of a ranch long gone, hearing his brother hum while the sky went violet. He saw his mother's hands shelling beans. He saw a life that had burned down to dust, and somehow, the song kept breathing through it. When it ended, the silence felt deeper, like a wound cleaned out. Jonah swallowed hard. "You knew about my brother," he said finally. "Before you found me." Tiva nodded once. The wind spoke his name first. Jonah leaned forward, elbows on knees, staring into the coals. He was a good man, stubborn, thought he could outrun storms. "And you?" Jonah laughed, a hollow sound. "I followed him, always have, even after he stopped being there to follow." Tiva stirred the fire with a stick. Sparks rose, brief and bright. "The land remembers all things," he said, "but men remember only what hurts most." Jonah looked across the flames. "You talk like you've lived more years than me." The boy tilted his head. "Age is just how long your shadow's been walking beside you. Some shadows learn fast." They sat, without speaking for a while. The stars crowded close, so many that the sky looked bruised. Jonah's throat ached again, not from thirst this time but from the weight of words he'd never said to anyone. "My pa used to say a man who rides alone ends up talking to ghosts," he murmured. Tiva poked the coals. "Maybe the ghosts talk first." Jonah smiled at that small, real. He reached for his saddlebag, pulled out a tin cup, and poured a trickle of the remaining water into it. "Share," he said, holding it toward the boy. Tiva didn't move. "You need it more." "That's not the point." The boy studied him a moment, then took it, drank, and handed it back. His voice softened. My grandmother said the first water you give after finding it decides whether the next spring you meet will welcome you. Jonah nodded. Then we're square. He lay back on the sand, hat over his eyes. The stars burned through the brim holes like needlepoints of fire. The wind shifted, cooler now, carrying the faint scent of sage and something older rain maybe. Still days away. Sleep came slow but steady. He woke before dawn. The fire had died to ash, and the horizon was a thin seam of gold. Tiva was already standing at the edge of the mesa, watching the east. The boy didn't turn as Jonah approached. It's strange, Jonah said, rubbing his neck. To see so much nothing and feel like it's looking back at you. The land always looks back, Tiva said. You just never looked long enough before. Below them, the plain rolled endless and pale, a sea of dry grass shimmering under morning breath. Far out, dust trailed maybe wind, maybe riders. Jonah squinted. You expecting someone? No, the boy said. But they come. Jonah's hand went instinctively to his hip. His revolver hung there, the leather cracked from heat. He hadn't drawn it since before meeting the boy. The gesture was old habit, but Tiva noticed. Guns don't scare thirst, the boy said quietly. No, Jonah admitted. But sometimes, they keep the men who cause it at a distance. They watched until the dust faded into the Sunday. When it did, Jonah let out a long breath. The world felt thinner without danger to focus on. He turned to Tiva. What now? We go east. There is a spring. My grandmother keeps it safe. She real? The boy's lips curved faintly. More real than you were yesterday. They descended the mesa. The trail wound through dry scrub and stone that glowed red in the morning light. Ash walked easy now, tail flicking. Jonah's body ached from the saddle, but it was a good ache, the kind that meant he was still here. By noon, heat returned, relentless as ever. They crossed a stretch of white ground where salt crusted like frost. Tiva moved with the same steady pace, untiring. Jonah lagged behind a little, lost in thought. You said your grandmother sent you, Jonah called. Why me? Out of all the fools dying out here, why this one? Tiva didn't turn. Because you carry two thirsts. One in your throat, one in your heart. And you can fix both? No one can fix what a man keeps choosing. Jonah chewed on that. The truth of it stung worse than the Sunday. He thought about all the places he'd run from, all the faces he'd left behind to make silence less heavy. Maybe that was what thirst really was, the sound of your own choices echoing back at you. They stopped beneath a rocky outcrop for shade. Tiva knelt, spreading cornmeal in a thin line, whispering words Jonah didn't catch. You praying? Jonah asked. Listening, Tiva said. Sometimes the ground talks first. Jonah crouched beside him. And what's it saying now? That your road doesn't end yet. He didn't know why that made his chest hurt, but it did. He reached into his coat, pulled out the rusted spur he'd taken from the cairn. It sat heavy in his palm. If I leave this here, maybe he'll rest. Tiva nodded. Maybe you will too. Jonah laid the spur in the dust. Slow, deliberate. For a heartbeat, it caught the sun and flared, bright as new silver, then dulled again. He felt lighter, though he couldn't say why. They mounted up and kept east, the sun dropping behind their backs. The land stretched endless and honest, and for the first time in years, Jonah didn't hate its silence. Part 4. The Healing. By late afternoon the light had turned the land to brass again. The horizon quivered where heat met air, and the plains went from gold to copper to the color of blood drying on stone. Jonah followed Tiva east through a cut of rock that narrowed into a valley small enough to miss unless you'd been born knowing where to look. A single cottonwood stood there, green, alive, defiant. Its leaves shimmered like tiny coins in the dying Sunday. At its roots, a pool no wider than a wagon wheel caught the sky and gave it back in pieces. The sound of trickling was faint but real, and Jonah felt something unclench inside his chest that had been knotted since Texas. Tiva stopped at the edge of the water and knelt. His movements were careful, reverent. Across the pool, a figure was waiting. She was small and bent with years, hair long and silver as moonlight, braided thick down her back. Her dress was buckskin, but finer than the boys stitched with beads in colors Jonah had no names for. Her face, dark and lined, held a stillness that made the whole place quieter. When her eyes lifted to his, Jonah forgot to breathe. Tiva spoke first. "Grandmother, I found him?" The old woman's gaze didn't move. "I know," she said. Her voice was smoke and riverbed stone. "The land told me before you came. This so meant to bring brot. Is it not all right note? It not to Biles comment." Jonah took off his hat, bowed slightly, unsure what courtesy was right for a woman who seemed older than the ground she stood on. "Ma'am," he said, his throat rasping, "I reckon I owe your boy more than I can say." Her eyes were sharp, but not cruel. "You owe no one. You were dying. He was sent to see if you were worth saving." Jonah's mouth opened, then shut again. The words hit deeper than he wanted to show. "And what's the verdict?" "That depends," she said, "on whether you still carry hate." He flinched, caught off guard. "I buried that years ago." "No," she said gently. "You planted it. It grew inside you, and it drank your strength like drought drinks rain. It was Albring Grode's quality. And Oskly ended just a beaded dies." Jonah looked away, jaw tightening. "I didn't know better." "You do now." Tiva stood silent beside her, hands clasped, eyes on the ground. The wind stirred the cottonwood, its leaves whispering like faraway voices. The old woman stepped closer to Jonah and reached for his hands. Her palms were dry, ridged like bark, but warm. "Sit," she said. He obeyed without thinking. She knelt opposite him, untying a small pouch from her belt. Inside was a mix of crushed herbs, dark resin, and bits of bark that smelled sharp and sweet. She dipped her fingers into the mixture, then reached toward his chest, not touching, just hovering, feeling the air as if reading invisible scars. "The wound is not on your body," she murmured. "It's in the place where you keep silence." Jonah didn't understand until she pressed her hand to his heart. He froze. The smell of sage filled the air. His pulse thudded against her palm like a trapped bird. She began to hum low, rhythmic, the same kind of chant Tiva had sung over the canyon. The sound wrapped around him, not loud but all-encompassing. The heat left his skin. He saw flashes: his brother's face, the spur half buried in the cairn, his mother's eyes, the battlefield, all of it rising, swirling, dissolving into the rhythm of her voice. He tried to pull back, but her other hand touched his forehead, anchoring him. "You have carried ghosts long enough," she whispered. "Let them ride on without you." Something broke. He didn't know if it was his pride or his grief, only that his breath came rough, and then steadied, like air after rain. His vision blurred. For the first time in decades, the tears didn't shame him. When she drew her hands away, the ache in his chest was still there, but it was clean, emptied of poison. The air smelled like wet stone. Even the flies had gone silent. She sat back, weary but smiling faintly. "Now you can drink without dying." Jonah looked at the pool. The surface trembled, reflecting firelight and sky. He crawled to it, cupped both hands, and drank. The water was cool as mercy. When he looked up again, the old woman was watching him with eyes that had seen everything. "You lost your brother to the desert," she said. "But the desert gave you another." Jonah turned to Tiva. The boy stood still as ever, but there was a softness in his face that hadn't been there before. Jonah nodded slowly. "You saved me, son." Tiva shook his head. "The land did. I just listened." The old woman smiled faintly, then rose with a grace that seemed to belong to another age. "Rest here tonight," she said. "At sunrise, your road will find you again, but walk it different." Jonah lowered his head. "Yes, ma'am. Seven tax fine to the south. From Circley and Desponley." She turned, walking toward the cottonwood, and for a moment he thought she vanished into it. The wind rustled the branches once more, and the pool rippled. Tiva spread his blanket by the fire. Jonah lay down beside it, hat over his face, staring up through the leaves where the stars burned faint between the green. For the first time in years, the silence didn't hurt. Part 5. The Road and the Memory. Morning came soft, not fierce. The light spilled across the valley like something cautious, unsure if it was welcome after so much night. Mist clung low around the cottonwood, silver threads drifting from the branches and coiling over the pool. The first sound was water whispering over stone. The second was a horse shaking dew from its mane. Jonah woke slow, as a man does when he's still afraid it's all a dream that might shatter if he moves too quick. He sat up, rubbed his eyes, and for a long while just watched the air, watched how it trembled with life instead of heat. His body ached, but the ache was honest. Not the gnaw of thirst, not the weight of guilt, just muscle and age, both bearable. Tiva crouched by the pool, refilling the water skin. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial. When he stood, he tossed the strap over his shoulder and faced Jonah. "She said the road finds me," Jonah murmured, still half asleep. "You know which one that is?" The boy tilted his head toward the east. "Always the one you don't want to take." Jonah huffed a laugh. "Figures." He packed the saddle slow, the way you do when you're not rushing from death anymore. The old woman was nowhere to be seen. Only her footprints, light, perfect, circled the cottonwood once, and stopped where the shadow of the trunk met the roots. He stared at that place for a moment, and thought he heard humming under the ground, faint as the sound of bees in deep summer. When they rode out, the sun was only a hand above the horizon. The air smelled clean. The trail wound upward between red rocks, where the world looked wider with every step. Jonah turned once to glance back. The valley was already fading, the cottonwood a green whisper in a field of gold. He blinked, and it was gone. "Was she real?" he asked without looking at the boy. Tiva's answer came steady. "The question is, are you? It next to go in today." Jonah smiled beneath his hat brim. "Guess we'll find out." They rode for hours. Maybe days' time had gone loose again. The country shifted from red to gray, from flat plains to broken hills where the wind kept its secrets. They passed old wagon ruts half swallowed by grass, bones of cattle scattered like forgotten prayers, and the burnt stubs of fence posts where settlers had once tried to tame something that never asked to be owned. At night they made small fires, or none. Tiva spoke little. Jonah found that he didn't need talk to fill the spaces anymore. The boy's silence wasn't the cold kind, it was alive, like music between notes. When he did speak, it was usually to point out something Jonah would have missed. A trail of ants crossing rock, a hawk nesting in a cleft, the way a dying cactus could still bloom once before it gave up. On the fourth evening, the wind changed again. It came from the north now, sharp and dry, carrying the smell of gun oil and sweat. Jonah recognized it before he saw the dust cloud forming on the horizon. "Riders," he said, squinting. "4, maybe 5. Tiva didn't even glance up. "They're following you." "Could be anyone," Jonah muttered, though his hand had already brushed the revolver at his hip. "Could be nobody." The boy looked at him then, dark eyes steady. "You left debts behind. They should didn't of the pines, for them musits and their prostents. The left of the interfeeling." Jonah said nothing. He didn't need to ask how the boy knew. The land always knew. By dusk, the riders had drawn close enough that Jonah could hear their spurs when the wind dropped. He saw shapes, men in dusters, rifles slung, faces shadowed under broad hats. The kind of men who carried old grudges like talismans. He felt the weight of years in his hand as he thumbed back the revolver's hammer. But Tiva shook his head. "Don't," the boy said. Jonah barked a low laugh. "They're not here to talk. They don't need to. The desert already judged." "What's that supposed to mean?" "That you've paid enough." The first shot cracked before Jonah could answer. It hit the dirt near his boot, spraying dust. Ash reared, screaming. Jonah swung into the saddle in one motion born of instinct, not thought. Bullets slapped stone. He wheeled the horse toward the rocks. "Tiva!" he shouted. But the boy had already moved fast, silent, toward a narrow crevice barely wide enough for 2 men abreast. Jonah followed, the sound of hooves thundering behind him. They plunged into the pass. Bullets ricocheted, whining off the stone walls. Jonah fired twice over his shoulder, saw one rider fall, the rest scatter. The echoes rolled on like thunder refusing to die. Then silence. Wind. The smell of powder. Jonah looked around. The crevice opened into a dead-end pocket surrounded by cliffs. No sign of the boy. "Tiva?" he called, breath rough. No answer. He slid off Ash, heart hammering, eyes scanning every shadow. A flicker of movement there, near the base of the cliff. He hurried over. The boy sat on a flat rock, untouched, calm. His waterskin lay beside him, not a mark on him. "They're gone," Jonah said, still panting. Tiva nodded. "The land doesn't let blood stay where it's not welcome." Jonah exhaled hard, sinking to one knee. "You could have been killed." "I've already died once," Tiva said simply. Jonah stared. Words caught behind his teeth. The boy's face held the same stillness as his grandmother's. In the silence, something shifted the air, the light, the shape of time itself. "What do you mean?" Jonah whispered. Tiva looked past him, toward the setting sun bleeding over the ridge. "Long ago, Snake River, soldiers came. My family ran. I was small. I didn't run fast enough." Jonah froze. His mouth went dry. "When?" "Before your brother died," the boy said. "He found me, tried to carry me from the fire. He was shot. He fell. I didn't wake again until the wind brought me back." Jonah's breath left him. The truth fell into place like stones in a grave. The boy met his eyes. "He asked me to forgive him for bringing the fire. So I forgave. Then I waited for you. In Myken in the sand. I budded a strand for mosten." Jonah's knees gave. He sat back against the rock, the revolver hanging loose in his hand. "All these years, I thought your people took him, killed him." Tiva's voice was soft. "He saved me. And I saved you. The circle ends here." Jonah's vision blurred again, not from dust. He pressed a hand over his face and laughed once, a broken, grateful sound. "Then you're not real." The boy smiled faintly. "Neither are you, not the way you were." The wind rose, swirling dust around them. Jonah blinked, and when he looked again, Tiva was gone. Only the waterskin lay on the stone, full to the brim. He stood slowly, every movement stiff, as if waking from a long sleep. The riders were gone. The air was still. He picked up the waterskin, tied it to his saddle, and mounted. He didn't look back. He rode east for weeks, through country that changed colors the way grief changes names. He passed settlements where men stared too long at strangers, towns where whiskey tasted like dust and hope cost more than gold. He worked odd jobs, branding, fencing, driving strays, never staying longer than a payday. Sometimes, at dusk, he'd stop by a campfire with other drifters. They'd ask where he came from. He'd shrug and say, "West of the sun, east of forgiveness," and they'd laugh because they thought it was a joke. He'd let them. When the fire got low and the talk turned to ghosts and luck, he'd tell his story, not all of it, just enough. A dying man, a Comanche boy, a spring that healed more than thirst. He'd say it plain, like reading scripture without trying to preach. Some believed him. Most didn't. That was fine. He wasn't telling it for them. Word spread, the way such things do. Travelers whispered of a spring guarded by a spirit boy, of a cowboy who'd wept beside the water and left his sins there. Some swore they'd seen him still riding, older now but steady, a black horse under him, silver showing at its muzzle. They said he always stopped at dusk, bowed his head toward the wind, and rode on. Years folded into more years. The world changed. New rail lines, fences, towns that grew and died again. Jonah changed too. His beard went white, his eyes pale but not blind. The scar on his heart stayed, but it had turned from wound to compass. One cold evening, in a town called Mercy Crossing, he sat outside the saloon, watching the sunset turn the windows red. A young rider tethered his horse nearby, nodded politely. Jonah nodded back. "Name's Carter," the boy said. "Heading west to find work. Heard there's land out there, still wild." Jonah smiled, something kind in it. "There's land. Wild's another matter. You been that way?" "Once," Jonah said. "It'll make a man honest, if it don't kill him first." The boy grinned, wide and eager, and went inside for a drink. Jonah stayed on the porch, hat low. The wind came up soft, bringing with it a smell he hadn't known in years, wet sage and river water. He closed his eyes. For a heartbeat, he heard the flutter of a braid's feather and a young voice saying, "You will die if you drink only that." He opened his eyes again. The sky had gone the color of a dying fire. He lifted his tin cup, filled not with whiskey but water, and poured a little into the dirt at his feet. "For the ones who wait," he murmured. Then he drank. The stars came out one by one, slow as forgiveness. The town lights blinked in the valley below, small and human. Jonah Reeves leaned back, boots crossed, hat pulled low. Somewhere out beyond the last ridge, the desert kept his secrets, and the wind still told stories about a cowboy and a boy who both learned how to listen. And when the wind moved through Mercy Crossing that night, it carried the sound of hooves, steady, unhurried, going nowhere a man could draw on a map. The road went on, and the land remembered. The West never forgets. Every man leaves something behind in its dust, a sin, a secret, or a story. Jonah Reeves left all three, and the desert kept them like holy relics. Some say the wind still carries his name. Others swear they've seen a rider at dusk, a black horse moving steady toward the horizon. Not lost, not found, just forgiven. If you felt this story, don't just ride on, subscribe, and stay a while. The desert has more tales to tell.